Hi, folks. Randy Houston here. And for half a century, the name Zeb Lee was synonymous with radio broadcasting in Asheville and Western North Carolina. Zeb founded radio station WSKY in 1947, and decade after decade, his love of radio created a legacy that we are remembering today here on Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan. Dave Hogan had the unique opportunity to be a part of WSKY for many years, and we invite you to eavesdrop on a conversation we had recently with Zeb's sons, Brian and Barry, as we remember Zeb and his amazing career as a radio station owner, announcer, and sportscaster.
Well, I'm Brian Lee with my brother Barry.
Hello.
And we're here to interview Dave Hogan and Randy Houston too, I hope.
I'll be glad to. I'll run the controls over here and keep you guys sounding good.
We're kind of looking at memories from the old radio days from the 60s and 70s and up until the future, I guess, here.
Especially WSKY.
That's right.
Which your dad put on the air in the 40s?
April 11th, 1947.
And
I wasn't around. But
I was just a toddler at that time.
Well, here's a question for you two. Maybe you know some history to this. We understand he came to Asheville in 1938, and he was part of the original Y staff. That's what we think we know. Wonder if you fellas know anything about that.
I'm not too. I heard Buddy Riesenberg, who worked for Zeb for many years, as you know, and I've just heard bits and pieces about how your dad wound up in Asheville, but not any real details.
Yeah.
Now, Buddy, who became the chief engineer later on, Buddy went to work for your dad, I think, in high school.
Out of high school.
Yeah. And that would have been in the 40s.
Yeah, 47.
Actually, I believe Buddy was working before he was out of high school. I think he was 15.
Yeah, he was in high school.
And stayed with your dad right until he retired.
He was with us at the FM, and he was there when we turned the power off.
Yeah.
So Buddy was with our family, and is still with our family. Lives across the street from my brother. So Buddy's been there for the whole ride.
You know, the Internet's an amazing thing. When we conversed about sitting down and doing these memories, I pulled up Broadcasting Magazine from 1960 in March, I think the 14th, 1960. I was working in a little town of West Jefferson, north of Boone in Ashe County, for Jimmy Childress, who kind of specialized in building small town radio stations, Burnsville, Silva, Murphy, and I was in West Jefferson, and I was 19 years old. And where I grew up in Western North Carolina, far Western North Carolina, way over in the mountains, Asheville is like New York City. We actually thought when you went to Asheville, you could see the ocean. You know, Asheville was down east. Okay.
Okay.
And so your goal, or my goal, being in broadcasting, was to get to Asheville at some point.
Sure.
And Broadcasting Magazine at that time was a magazine that went to radio stations around the country weekly. And radio station news and news stations that were going on the air, all kinds of radio news. And in the back of it, it had want ads. Stations could put an ad for announcers or engineers, whatever they needed. And announcers looking for a job could put ads in there. So I'm thumbing through it. Usually the general manager of the station would hide it from the staff because didn't want you to see it. Now I got a hold of it some way. And I found an ad. This is March the 14th, 1960, page 103 of Broadcasting Magazine.
I can't believe you've got that date. That's amazing.
It
Yeah.
is
And
amazing.
here's how the ad read: 40 hours pay for 32 hours work. Resort City in North Carolina needs bright-voiced, well-seasoned announcer, third-class ticket for early AM show. Ideal living conditions, congenial staff. Send tape and availability to Program Director, WSKY, Asheville, North Carolina. 2 years minimum experience, please. I saw that ad, and I didn't mail a tape. I got in my car, and I drove to Asheville and answered that ad in person. Walked up the stairs. The station, WSKY, was on Church Street, downtown Asheville. Got there a little after 5 and met Maggie McCants, who was the secretary, or probably more...
I think she was more the bookkeeper.
bookkeeper. That's
Yeah.
right. That's
Okay.
right. That's right. She was the bookkeeper. Because I remember when I needed an advance on my check, I'd go to your dad, and I'd say, Zeb, I'm short this week. Go see Maggie and tell her how much you need. That's the kind of person your dad was, by the way, as if you probably didn't know.
That's why we ended up with nothing. Now we know.
Generous to a fault.
Yeah, he was the kind of guy to give you the shirt off his
He
back.
was a very generous
man,
person.
he
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
We'll talk more about him in a moment. But to finish the story, Maggie was there, and it was after normal business hours. But your dad, for years, did sports at 6:00
Oh, yeah. I used to
every
listen
night
to
at
it.
6:00.
The sports parade.
The sports parade.
Okay.
So he was still at the station, and Maggie introduced me to Zeb Lee, the owner of WSKY, which, I didn't think I'd get to see the owner. I was just wanted to leave the tape, and I wanted to beat everybody else who were going to mail in tapes. I wanted to have mine there first. So I drove down there,
Smart.
and I talked to Zeb for probably, till his sports, it was almost time for his sports show. And he said, well, the person you need to talk to is Al Levy. He's the program director. Let me call Al. So he dialed up Al. Al came down, interviewed me, and I left the tape with Al. They called me about a week later and said, come back for another interview, and I did and got hired. $80 a week in March of 1960. Went to work in April of 1960, and there was a big snowstorm that year. One of the biggest ever.
Yes,
in
there was.
Western North Carolina.
Yes.
And, Randy, up in West Jefferson there in the mountain country,
Big
the
snow.
National Guard came in and dropped food to livestock and actually dropped food to people. And when I left West Jefferson and came to Asheville to go to work on April 21st, I believe, in 1960, there was still snow on the ground up there
Oh, yeah.
in April. So that's how I came to work for your dad, and worked for him for 17 years till 1977.
Well, can I ask a question, do a little detective work here? The ad you just read in Broadcast Magazine said they were looking for a morning personality.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Help me out here with Farmer Russ, who did mornings.
He came later.
Okay. All right.
Cactus Pete Williams had left the station and had gone to Canada, somewhere in Canada, to take a job at a radio station. St. John's, Newfoundland, I believe. And so that created the vacancy that I got hired for. And not just WSKY, but a lot of stations at that time were kind of on a kick of doing split shifts.
Yeah.
And I went into WSKY early in the morning. I worked like from 5 till 8, and then I came back from 11 till 1 or something like that.
Right.
And so that's the shift that I worked when I first came there. But your dad, I was 19 years old, and in a lot of ways he was a father to me. Because you talk about somebody who fell off a turnip truck and didn't know up from down, that was me. and your dad was, and we had our father-son squabbles too, from time to time.
I've had a few of those with him too. So.
It was a great experience, and one thing besides the radio, the professional part, for me, going to work at WSKY at that time was like turning on a cultural light, because I grew up in a small community, valley town in Cherokee County near Andrews and Murphy. And you don't hear the term WASP much anymore, do you?
No.
But you know what I'm talking about? When I say WASP, most of the people were WASPs over there, including me, you know, growing up. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant is what WASP stood for.
Okay.
And it was used a lot. WASP, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, WASP. And mostly Baptist, a few Methodist, a few Church of God. But that was the kind of society that I grew up in. And I go into WSKY, and your dad was a Christian Scientist. Al Levy, the program director, and Lou Rondra, the copywriter, were Catholics. Buddy Riesenberg was and is a Jew.
Yeah.
And Robert Martin, who became a very close friend, was black. He was the janitor and worked also for Belks. And he would come into WSKY early in the morning when I was there and bring me coffee. And we became very close. And in those days of segregation, Robert and I both were baseball fans. And the first thing he wanted to know, what were the scores from the night before? And so we bonded over that. But we couldn't go to McCormick Field and sit together at a baseball game.
Oh, gee.
Wow.
You know, the blacks had their section.
Yeah.
Wow.
And about the only thing we could do together was go fishing. And we'd go down on the French Broad River and fish. And,
Right.
But I still miss him to this day. And I was privileged to do the eulogy when Robert died. But meeting these people for the first time who had these different religious views and these different backgrounds shaped my worldview, really. And I'm thankful for that part of the WSKY experience.
Well, Barry and I have said many, many times that we kind of won the lottery with our parents.
Mm-hmm.
We chose wisely, and our upbringing and the people we got to be around. In radio, you could, I know when I became a teenager especially, I could walk into the station and you never knew who was going to be there. Or somebody would be coming by to see our dad that he'd known from sports or entertainment, theater, something. I was always, it was always kept you on your toes.
And, you know, people say, tend to think of people in the media as being more culturally liberal, and we are because of the very things we're talking about. You meet all kinds of people with all kinds of opinions, all kinds of views, so you become a little more open-minded, a whole lot more open-minded in my case, as to how you deal with your fellow man. But in 1960, FM at that time was not in the picture. I mean, there was an FM station, WLOS FM at the time, easy listening, and they had a few listeners, but mainly WWNC 570 on the dial, WSKY 1230, WLS AM was 1380.
Yeah. At the
and
time,
Wise was 1310.
right at the time it was WLOS AM before it became WKKE.
Right. So you had four stations that people listened to, and for most of the 1960s, WSKY dominated the market. Now
We saw some ratings. They weren't Arbitron. There was some service that was before Arbitron. And some of the percentages we saw that we had were just, we couldn't believe it. Yeah.
Amazing.
40% share, 30, whatever.
Yeah.
I'm going to do a little bragging right here, if you don't mind.
Please.
speaking from a purely professional standpoint. Probably my greatest accomplishment in broadcasting was convincing your dad to play country music, because he was dead set against it. But that's no reflection on your dad. Everybody else was. You couldn't find country music on the radio, except maybe in the little small towns where you did what we call block programming. You'd have a little country music, a little gospel music. You'd have a little easy listening music, a little big band music. And I loved that part of my early career because I learned a lot of different styles of music. Mm-hmm. Played rock and roll in the afternoon after school was out. So at that time, 1960, Elvis, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, a little later on, the Beatles, it's just blown country music away.
Yeah.
And nobody played country music on the radio. But I don't know why, but one of my broadcasting philosophies all through the years when I was program director for a station over in Johnson City, and was to try to do something that nobody else was doing. And at that time, those 4 stations that I mentioned were all doing a different form of basically the same thing. Now, WISE was top 40. WSKY, we were playing, we called it chicken rock. And that
would chicken rock?
Chicken rock. And that would now be called light rock or soft rock.
Okay.
We didn't play the hard stuff. We were
Right.
playing people like Dean Martin and Perry Como and Kitty Callan, people like that. The softer chart music, they were hit records, but they were...
Later, that probably became known as adult contemporary at some point. In the late 70s.
Yeah, music
maybe.
changes, of course, down through the years. But that's what we were playing. We weren't playing any country music. But I had played country music for an hour or two each day in the little markets I worked in. And it lit up the phones. And after I'd been in Asheville for a few months, I got to thinking, nobody's playing any country music in Asheville. None of these stations played country music at all. And there were people like Patsy Cline, Marty Robbins, Eddie Arnold, Johnny Cash, who began to have these, what became known as the Nashville sound, and they became crossover hits.
Mm-hmm.
Country music that appealed to a broader audience. So I would mention to your dad, we ought to have a country music show. Nah, country music dead. It's gone. It's dead. And I did the same with gospel music. I said, nobody's playing any gospel music. I said, we're in Western North Carolina. People love gospel music. Well, he finally let me do some gospel music for 2 hours on Sunday morning. I've told Randy this story.
I'm anxious for you to hear it again, yeah.
There was at that time, by this time we're probably into the early part of 1961, and aluminum siding was just becoming a thing that people were putting on their houses. And so this aluminum siding company came and bought some advertising on a PI basis. That stands for per inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
And the radio station would get $1 or $2 or whatever it was for each inquiry about their product. You'd get listeners to call in if they're interested, and you'd make a list of Brian Lee, such and such phone number, is interested in aluminum siding. And that would give the aluminum siding company these leads.
Right.
Well, they bought some advertising on WSKY, and we get a few leads every now and then. And then I had a couple of, maybe 3 or 4 of those ads on Sunday morning, that 2 hours from 6 till 8,
Right.
that I was playing gospel music. And I remember the next day, Zeb came in and said, "You get any calls for the, whatever the name of the company was, the aluminum siding company?" And I had a list of 100 names, close to 100 names. And during the week on the other ads, altogether, we may have had 10. And your dad's eyes got real big, and started figuring up how much money we were going to collect from that company. And I said, Zeb, if I could do a little more gospel music on Sunday morning, I'd get more ads. Okay, how much you want to do?
Decision
So
made.
that's how Gospel Hymn Time came about on Sunday morning, from 6 till 10. And for years, it was an institution. Everybody, I mean, you talk about ratings. I saw some of the ratings early on, probably from that you saw. And the ratings on Sunday morning, nobody else had any listeners. I mean, Gospel Hymn Time was really a dominant. And so from that point on, Zeb would listen to what I had to say when it came to music. And that's how I got Country Star Time started at 11 o'clock, maybe 11:30, I think, in the morning. And it became extremely popular. And then I guess I played country music some during the morning slot, and then those shifts changed. And then Farmer Russ came to the station. I'm not sure of the year, but sometime in the early 60s. And we stopped the split shift thing. And Farmer Russ would come in and do the morning show. And of course, he didn't play much music. He played a few things now and then, but he'd do things like sending the kids off to school, and I'm sure you remember that.
Oh, sure, I do.
Yeah, me too.
And so I was working over a period of time, a midday show when I started the Country Star Time program. And then later on, I did it in the afternoon. I just can't remember exactly how the shifts came into existence at that time. But that's the way, and we started playing that country music several hours a day, not 24 hours a day, but several hours a day. And WSKY was dominant during the 1960s. That and sports made WSKY in 1960.
Yeah, our dad liked sports.
And he covered
a little bit.
I remember going with him to a lot of football games.
Uh-huh.
And he would always insist on driving back, no matter how far we went, to Charlotte or where. He would drive back that night. There was no overnight stay.
There's a story. Do you remember so high school football was Friday nights?
Yeah, Friday night. Western Carolina.
For quite a few years, he covered Western, which is college, and that was Saturdays.
Mm-hmm.
Usually not at night, usually early afternoon. So I don't know how many times they did this, and I don't know why Buddy didn't quit, but we need to talk to Buddy about this. But Asheville had to schedule a team all the way out on the coast, Elizabeth City, coast of North Carolina. So for whatever reason, our dad didn't go and go down Thursday and get a room, or Friday and get a room, and then come back the next day. They drove down Friday to do the game. Then from there, they would come back to do the Western Carolina football game. And at least on one occasion, it was in Tennessee or Kentucky.
My goodness.
So he had to drive all the way from Elizabeth City to, completely nuts.
Wow.
We still don't know how. And he probably did all the driving too.
Yeah. I didn't make that trip to Elizabeth City, but I went with just because I was a sports fan too. I went with and occasionally did some of the live commercials during the game. But I went with your dad, and Buddy always came along, but he set the equipment up. And in those days, it was a little more complicated than it is today. So I went with your dad and Buddy Riesenberg to many high school football games on Friday night and to Western Carolina games on Saturday. But your dad would always insist on going back home that night. Yeah. Never would stay overnight. We'd get back into Asheville 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning sometimes.
Or 6 if it was completely nuts. But even as a kid, when I was old enough, they'd let me come to some of those away games. Mm-hmm. And yeah.
And in the day, you talked about, why Buddy quit. It's not like it is today with cell phones. You just go to Elizabeth City and fire up a cell phone and call back to the station and do your broadcast. A telephone line had to be ordered from Bell South. And
No. You're partly right.
Yeah.
It was more complicated than that. Every little community had their own telephone company.
That's right. It wasn't Bell South. You're
And
right.
so you had to order a line,
Yep.
a special telephone line, and so sometimes every once in a while the phone company would screw it up and wouldn't get the line put in. So they would go down. You remember how early you'd show up for these football games? You'd be 3 or 4 hours early
to test out that line,
to make sure the line was live.
Yeah.
And Buddy was a genius at keeping.
He was,
and they always got on the air.
Your dad and Buddy had a long. Do I recall correctly? And two of the sweetest people I've ever known. Your mother Betty. And Buddy's wife, Mary. Do I remember correctly that your dad and Buddy met their wives at S&W cafeteria? They were working at S&W?
No, for our mom.
This is a good story. You mentioned a few minutes ago Perry Como. Here's the story. Sometime in 1949, I guess Dad might have been working the board at the station and got a call, a request. A young woman called in, made a request to hear "I Don't See Me in Your Eyes Anymore" by Perry Como. And that was our mom. And that's how she met Dad. Oh. And from that point on, she'd call and they'd talk on the phone until they finally met in person.
I've heard of that happening a couple of different times in my radio career. Yeah, that's great.
Well, it happened to me.
And as far as how Buddy met Mary,
that I'm confident that Buddy met Mary at the S&W. Mary was working there, and of course, the S&W was right around the corner from the radio station.
We'll ask. I haven't heard that story, but yeah, we'll ask about that.
But speaking of the S&W cafeteria, and I mentioned earlier that my experience in small town radio became very helpful because it acquainted me with all these different formats. Came in handy later on because Randy and I worked at WISE in the 1990s doing American standards, I guess you would call it, and big band music.
Right.
And very successful, very, very, very large listenership. But also, in my latter years before I retired, for most of a decade, maybe about 7 or 8 years, I did talk radio, co-hosted a talk show in the morning from 6 until 9. And didn't play any music at all. I was a talk radio host. And I remember when the general manager of the station came in to tell me they wanted to make a talk station. And he said, "Do you think you could do a talk show?" And you know what I thought of? Open mic on WSKY at the S&W cafeteria. And
that brings back memories.
Yeah.
And we had one of those permanent telephone line outside the S&W cafeteria. Mm-hmm. And for several years, I, along with Hal Edwards.
Yeah, Hal.
You remember Hal?
I do, yeah.
We did that open mic show. And then I can't remember how it came about, but then your dad started doing it every day. But now, if you talk about doing talk radio, I mean, this is you talk about, it's cold. I mean, you're grabbing. The reason you had to have two people is because one person had to be recruiting people to come talk. And I did that for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years. And Hal Edwards, and there was somebody else, maybe Dick Bowman, at one time who co-hosted the program with me. And that was, I didn't like it at the time. I hated it, but a lot of things in your life you don't like at the time it happens, but you look back on it and you're thankful that you had that experience.
Well, you think about going live on the street and just out of the clear blue asking someone, what do you think about climate change? Boom.
One of the funnest stories, and I've told this, when you're in the radio business, Randy will know this as well, and you're on the air a lot, you get a lot of requests to speak to civic organizations, Lions clubs, Kiwanis clubs, Rotary clubs, that sort of thing. And I would often tell this story, and I'd always get a big chuckle out of it. And I think I told Buddy this story. I mean, Buddy may have heard it live. But I was down there doing that program by myself one day. I think with Hal Edwards. Hal was also a salesman. He was one of the station's salespeople. And sometimes I'd get tied up with a client or for whatever reason. 11 o'clock would come around and I'd be by myself. And it's hard to do a talk show standing in front of the S&W cafeteria by yourself, trying to get people to come talk to you. Well, times were tough for me financially at this particular time in my life. And I'd often get behind on my car payment. And the fellow from the bank knew that I'd be on the air down there.
Oh, no.
And he would come down. He would come down and stand in the shadows there, waiting on me to get off the air.
I've never heard this one.
To put me up, to try to collect the car payment from me.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So you can't run from people when you're on the radio. They know where you are. If you owe them a bill, they'll come get it. But anyway, this particular day, it's cold, blustery, and you're freezing, and you're standing there. And a fellow walks up to me, and he looked at me, and he said, "You're Jewish, aren't you?" I said, "No, thanks for the compliment, but I'm not." "Oh, yes, you are." Said, "You Jews ought to be ashamed of who you are." And he argued with me about 5 minutes over me allegedly being Jewish.
Is this on the air?
This is on the air live. Yes, on the air live.
I'm sure that went over well.
Well, the banker that I mentioned that was trying to collect the car payment was there that day. His name was Joe, and he was standing over the side. And I got better acquainted with Joe later on, after things changed and we became good friends. But Joe was standing over there, and I didn't have anybody else to talk to. As soon as I got rid of the guy that I was talking to about being Jewish, Joe was the only person around. So here I'm going to have to talk to the guy trying to collect my car payment. So I called him, and Joe, come over, and we had always had a topic of the day that you asked the opinion of the person on. So I asked Joe, and Joe says, "I don't know anything about your topic of the day, but I do know one thing. You're not a Jew, or you wouldn't be behind on your car payment." Live radio.
Be sure to click the subscribe button for another episode of Hot Mic with Randy Houston and Dave Hogan.